What is the greatest I'll do it myself in history? Part 1. Jonas Salk needed human subjects to test his polio vaccine. That's normally a long process, and he wanted to make the vaccine available as quickly as possible, so he just experimented on himself. Canadian soldier Leo Major and his friend, Willie Arsenault, were scouting a Dutch town called Zwolle that had been captured by Germans in World War II. On the scouting trip, the two had decided to liberate Zwolle together, but were separated, and Arsenault was killed. Major, enraged, killed 2 Germans while the rest fled. On the outskirts of the town, Major intercepted a vehicle, disarming the soldiers there. He told a French-speaking soldier that all the Canadian artillery would be firing on the town in the morning, and decidedly let the Nazi free to spread the rumor, even returning his weapon as a total alpha move. That night, Major decided to single-handedly liberate the town. Arming himself with many weapons, he made explosions and noise, making it sound like the entire Canadian army was there. Several times that night, Major went back and forth from Zwolle to the Canadian base, taking 8 to 10 German prisoners each time. At one point, Major located the Gestapo, high-ranking Nazis, headquarters, and raided it himself. He killed several SS officers, and the rest fled. By morning, Major discovered that the Germans who had taken Zwolle had entirely retreated. I should also mention that Major was a sniper who had only one eye from a phosphorus grenade explosion years prior, and remained in the military because he insisted he only needed one eye to aim his weapon, and that to him, he looked like a pirate. The Dutch town of Zwolle was liberated by a one-eyed sniper. He has several other legendary acts, but this to me was his best. Otis invented pretty much what we consider the modern elevator. Nobody was convinced it was safe, so he hoisted himself up extremely high and had somebody cut the cable with an axe to prove how confident he was that the elevator was safe, regardless of almost worst-case scenarios. To finish OP's story, the safety locking mechanism kicked in, and the elevator stopped after only a few inches. He survived. Had it failed there at the New York World's Fair, we probably wouldn't have elevators today. Cliff Stoll, the cuckoo's egg, noticed weird traffic on his university servers. No one believed him that there was any risk occurring. Ended up uncovering a major hacking attempt to steal missile designs and basically created internet security. I think it was missile designs, it's been a long time. In 1888, Ullman Brown Stroger, an undertaker, noticed he was losing a lot of business to the other undertaker in town. He found out that the other undertaker's wife was a telephone operator, and when she intercepted people asking to be connected to Stroger's funeral home, the operator would route the call to her husband's funeral home instead. 3 years later, Stroger patented the automatic teller exchange, a system which allowed telephone users to make calls without the need for human operators, single-handedly destroying an entire workforce. Jon Snow, not that one, the father of epidemiology. No one believed him that the cholera outbreak in what is now Soho was because of a contaminated water pump. He broke it. They arrested him for vandalism and held him until the outbreak suddenly ended. Donald Knuth is one of the big names in computer science. Back in the 1960s, he set out to write the definitive texts on computer programming and analysis of algorithms. The first 3 volumes came out, and he started the 4th in the early to mid-1970s. He was unhappy with how the newer printing and editions were typeset, so he took a summer to solve that problem. A decade later, the 4th volume still had not been completed, but as a consolation prize, we got TeX, later extended to the more commonly used LaTeX, without question the most comprehensive and powerful language for creating documents with heavy technical requirements. It is a strange mix of a markup language like HTML and a compiled language like C. It is completely free and has been for well over 30 years, and is probably the most bug-free piece of software I've ever seen. Certainly, for its size and scope, there is not much out there of comparable quality. There is literally no mathematics that cannot be properly typeset in TeX or LaTeX. Its default style is instantly recognizable to any working mathematician. It is used across nearly all STEM fields, and there are hundreds, if not thousands, of journals that only accept manuscripts written in LaTeX. It wasn't until the early 2000s that drafts of the 4th volume started to appear. Nobody has seemed to mind. Let's not forget that Isaac Newton ran out of math to work with and was like, I guess I'll just invent calculus then. Probably the time Nando Parado and Roberto Canessa decided they couldn't wait around any longer and legged it for 10 days across the Andes with no warm clothes, climbing gear, or food except some scraps of their dead friends stuffed into a sock. They finally found someone out in the middle of nowhere, Sergio Catalan, who rode horseback all night and then took a bus to get some help. The mountain climbers had come from the wreckage of a crashed plane that everyone had been looking for over 2 months. They needed help for the other survivors who were injured and starving. They saved 14 of their friends. It's got to be Emo Koivunen. He was a Finnish soldier in the Second World War where the Finns were trying to reclaim land from the Soviets. He got separated from his unit mid-war in the middle of nowhere. He was the one tasked to carry the drugs they held in case of injury or tiredness, one of which was Pervidin, which was literal meth in a tablet form. Instead of just taking 1 or 2, he downed the whole bottle and went on a weeks-long methed-up rampage. He got hit by a landmine, evaded Soviet soldiers, caught up a bird and ate it raw, all while on skis. He finally made it back to finish lines where, on arrival, he weighed only 90 pounds or so, and he had a heart rate of 200 beats per minute. He ended up living for another 45 years. I love it whenever the story gets mentioned. It's so crazy as to be unbelievable, but it's true. A movie needs to be made about this guy. Brian Acton interviewed at Facebook and got turned down. He said screw it and built WhatsApp. Several years later, Facebook bought WhatsApp for $19 billion. Maurice Hilleman invented over 40 vaccines during his career in the pharmaceutical industry. In 1963, his oldest daughter caught the mumps. He cultured a sample from her, developed a vaccine, and injected it into his younger daughter. That vaccine is still in use and has saved millions of lives. In total, it's estimated that his work has saved 118 million lives globally. Fun fact, this vaccine is also the fastest ever to be made in history, from start to finish taking only 4 years from the beginning of development to the first distribution. This is also why it is unlikely that we will get a vaccine faster than a year for the current epidemic. The guy who started FedEx wrote a college paper on an overnight shipping company and got a C. Started the company anyways. Later, after he started it and it was struggling, he couldn't get a loan and the company was almost bankrupt, and he bet next week's payroll at the casino on blackjack and won. Also got a Silver Star in the Vietnam War, and now co-owns the Washington Redskins. The latter are often viewed as the biggest failure in his life. Keep in mind that this was in 1962 before grade inflation really took off nationwide, so a C at Yale didn't necessarily mean it was a bad paper. And even then, the idea could have been great, but he could have expressed it really poorly, or maybe it wasn't yet well thought out. IIRC, it was the opposite. The teacher claimed that the paper was well written, but the idea itself was unfeasible. The giant Norse axeman who held the choke point at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. By the time the bulk of the English army arrived, the Vikings on the west side were either slain or fleeing across the bridge. The English advance was then delayed by the need to pass through the choke point presented by the bridge itself. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle has it that a giant Norse axeman, possibly armed with a Dane axe, blocked the narrow crossing and single-handedly held up the entire English army. The story is that this axeman cut down up to 40 Englishmen and was defeated only when an English soldier floated under the bridge in a half-barrel and thrust his spear through the planks in the bridge, mortally wounding the axeman. I'm surprised no one's mentioned Catherine the Great of Russia. She decided her husband was useless, which granted he was, and proceeded to set up a military coup to overthrow him. Even with the plan being discovered early, she dressed herself in military garb and marched with her new army, which had just sworn loyalty to her, down to Peter's palace, where he was forced to resign the throne, all without a single drop of bloodshed. At least until Peter turned up dead sometime later under shady circumstances, but honestly, for a military coup, it was pretty non-violent. If saying, screw it, I'm ruling Russia myself, isn't great, I don't know what is. I mean, it's right there next to her name for a reason. Not a very old story. Manji, or the Mountain Man, lived in a very remote village of India whose route to nearby was blocked by a mountain, and hence villagers had to climb it every time. And they had to do that daily to get essential supplies. During one of these trips, his wife fell down the mountain. He loved her a lot. He tried first to persuade the government to do a mountain tunnel project there, but to vain. So he went on alone to break the entire mountain with just an axe. He did that for 10+ years and finally succeeded. There's a Bollywood movie on him too, title Manji, the Mountain Man. Nikola Tesla was tasked with lighting up the World's Fair, but Thomas Edison wouldn't allow him to use any of his patents, so Tesla had to invent a new light bulb that didn't use any of Edison's patents and could still have thousands made in time for the event. Tesla was definitely one of the most underrated geniuses of his time. I believe he died penniless in 1943. He chooses to be penniless, and releasing Westinghouse from his patents only made it worse. He could have licensed his technology and died in a mansion in New York. With that being said, his name alone today is worth more than the great majority of millionaires of his era. Desmond Doss single-handedly saved from 50 to 100 men up on Hacksaw Ridge in Okinawa. His company was ordered to retreat when they were attacked by the Japanese, but instead, he said, nah, stayed up on the ridge alone, unarmed, and dragged as many soldiers as he could to safety without any help. When he was shot by a sniper and riddled with shrapnel, he made sure they took another guy down the hillside before him. Australian stretcher-bearer Leslie Allen did a similar thing on Mount Tambu. Carried out 12 men, one at a time on his back alone. Received a Silver Star. James Clerk Maxwell was idolized by Einstein as being the father of modern physics. Not only did he formulate the classical theory of electromagnetic radiation, but just for giggles, he calculated exactly what Saturn's rings were made from using pure mathematics. It wasn't until Voyager 1 and 2 passed by and took photos in the early 80s did we get confirmation that Maxwell was right. He then calculated how to take a color photograph in 1855. This was then achieved in 1861 and is recognized as the first ever color photograph. Don't forget his advances in statistical mechanics. In 1947, a guy named Thor Heyerdahl was trying to prove his theory that the Polynesian islands were settled by people from South America, not Asia. Nobody believed him because it was thought that crossing such a large ocean with the technology they had back then was impossible. So he decides to build a boat using only the tools and materials available at the time these migrations took place. And then he sailed that boat across the Pacific Ocean, nearly dying in the process, but ultimately making it to the Polynesian islands.